Hello ladies and gentlemen, Top Hat Gaming Man here. Last week on my channel I uploaded a little video on why I feel the Nintendo 64 is so overrated today. Today I am doing another follow-up video to that on why I feel the Gamecube is possibly overrated. And when I say overrated, that's got a question mark on the end. Not like my previous video where I said the Nintendo 64 is overrated and that had a bloody exclamation mark. That was a definite, this is a maybe. So let's explore that today. The reason why I say overrated with a question mark on the end, because there appears to be many polarizing views on the system online. I feel that younger people, maybe in their early 20s, look at this system with a lot more nostalgia than a lot of other people would for obvious reasons, and because of that they seem to think a lot higher of this console than perhaps it should be. And again, the same thing can be said for the older generations who perhaps do not give the system enough credit it deserves. Being such experienced gamers, they'd obviously been through a lot of consoles already by that point, and they may have bypassed the Gamecube completely and just gone for a PlayStation 2 for example. In regards to the Gamecube, it was the second back-to-back Nintendo console that had its arse completely kicked by Sony. Unfortunately for the Gamecube though, unlike the Nintendo 64, they also had Microsoft to deal with. So not only did this little thing have its arse kicked by the PlayStation 2, but it also had its arse kicked by the original Xbox as well. So it got a double bloody arse kicking. Let's think back. Obviously you had the PlayStation 2 release quite a long time, if I recall, before the Gamecube release. So before this thing came out, the majority of people already had PlayStation 2s in their households anyway. So that gave Sony a massive competitive advantage over the Gamecube without having to even lift a finger. They also had all the momentum coming off of the PlayStation, which was an absolutely huge success, and the Nintendo 64 on the other hand was a little bit lackluster. I was 16 years old when this little thing was released, and if I recall, I got the PlayStation 2 for Christmas before this thing came out. Like anyone else sound of mind, I suppose, we already had PlayStation 2s before this thing had even managed to launch. However, I did get one of these in, I believe it was June when it came out. I got one at launch, and there was one big unique selling point which led my parents to actually get me one of these. And if I recall, it was extremely cheap on release. So because of that, if you had a PlayStation 2 already, it didn't affect your wallet that badly by adding one of these to your repertoire as well, because it was just so cheap. Like this, for example, I've got multiple Gamecubes. Like this is my parents' holiday home over in Greece, and the reason why there is a Gamecube here, because if I recall, they bought this, my mother bought this house around the same sort of time. And because of that, she wanted a games console to be out here for guests to play and stuff like that. So the Gamecube was the obvious option because it was so cheap. So because of that, my mother actually bought me two. So yes, in my opinion, the cheap price point was a major advantage for the Gamecube. If you looked at the PlayStation 2 and later the original Xbox, both of those were much more expensive to buy if you wanted to have those as well. Now let's look at some of the disadvantages of this bloody thing. The first thing I would say is, which I find absolutely outrageous. Do you remember I moaned in my last video about Nintendo 64 going for a horrible form of media with their console? We was deep into the CD era by that point, and just because they were idiots and were scared of a couple of people pirating their games, they went for a primitive cartridge-based format of games instead. And the problem with cartridges, you could fit a lot less space on them, and on top of that as well, they was more expensive. Once again, Nintendo decided to go for a media form where you had less space. For some reason, they had these stupid mini CDs, what you put inside instead, and which obviously have a lot less space on them than a full-size CD. And because of that reason, obviously it is harder to pirate once again, which I don't think piracy was that big a problem in that time period anyway to affect sales that negatively. But yes, the optical media again is terrible in comparison to what you had on the PlayStation 2 and the Microsoft Xbox. So once again, this is a prime example of Nintendo cutting corners and releasing an inferior product just so that the minority can't get pirate games. Instead, we just cut off our noses to spite our face, and we just give an inferior product out to the majority. Yeah. So, the PlayStation 2, was it pirated that bad that Sony lost so much money that they came last place in the console wars? No, they bloody won, didn't they? Because they wasn't scared of pirates and had a crappy optical drive. Another complaint I sometimes hear about the Gamecube is the aesthetic appearance. Personally, I think the thing looks rather swish, I must say. Certainly a lot nicer than that original Xbox, which looks like a bloody VCR's brother cousin. That thing looks absolutely horrible, doesn't it? And it weighs a bloody ton. This thing's nice and refined. However, if I remember, it was mainly marketed in all the advertising campaigns in that ugly purple colour, which makes it look like it was made by bloody Playmobil or Fisher-Price or something like that. Another thing about the Gamecube as well, it hasn't really got that many unique features as a console. Like the Nintendo Switch conference is a prime example of that. They mentioned that all the various consoles had elements they took in order to make the Switch. The thing what they took from the Gamecube apparently was the portability, because apparently this is portable. So the only unique thing about the Gamecube in comparison to other Nintendo consoles is it has a bloody handle apparently. That is the most memorable thing about the Gamecube according to Nintendo. It has a handle. Something else I find rather odd about the Gamecube is some of the younger fans who are in their early 20s. Many of them truly do believe that the Gamecube is the best console of all time. It came bloody third in the console race for a reason, because the other products on the market were superior. The PlayStation 2, as I said, had a better optical drive, but more importantly, it had a bigger library of games with much more third-party support. If you look back, the Super Nintendo, that had lots of third-party support and it had lots of great first-party titles as well. So if you're going to say the best console of all time, it's not even the best Nintendo console of all time, because the Super Nintendo kicks its ass as well. I would say though it is, in terms of the game library, probably a step up from the Nintendo 64. They did get quite a few more third parties involved, if I recall too. Speaking of the games, this is the last console, what I can recall, that really had a big emphasis on 4-player local multiplayer, which was great fun, just like the Nintendo 64. It wasn't long after that that Microsoft essentially ruined everything, and they turned everyone into a bunch of bedroom-dwelling bastards who waste their time playing multiplayer games with strangers online. Something I've never really wished to delve into, because that does not sound like my idea of fun. I was always taught to never speak to strangers online. Right, so let's talk about some of the games. One of the most memorable games on the whole system for me was probably Super Smash Bros. Melee. I wouldn't say it's the ultimate game in the series these days, but it certainly featured the biggest step-ups in the Smash Bros. Series in history, in my opinion. And yes, it was just such a huge upgrade from the one on the Nintendo 64, and it just had so many more characters, play modes, you name it. Smash Bros. Melee added it to the fight. Nintendo biggest new IP for the system, intellectual property I suppose, was Pikmin. They released Pikmin 1 and 2 both on the Gamecube, and they was amongst my favourite games on the whole platform. They were definitely new, innovative games in which I had a lot of fun with, and I liked number 3 as well, which was on the Wii U recently. Another fun, really unique game for the platform was of course Luigi's Mansion, which I believe was one of the launch titles for the platform. I had a lot of fun with that game, and it was certainly different from anything I had played previously. And if I recall, there wasn't a whole lot of fanfare about the thing when it was released. I think even the reviews for the game were quite average, which made it quite a pleasant surprise to play when I actually bought the GameCube myself. On top of that as well, there's the great sequel on the 3DS, which I think is actually far superior to the GameCube version, which in a way makes the GameCube game a little bit obsolete today, I feel. Another game of note, Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker. Obviously I'm not going to talk about the Twilight Princess because I don't tend to even think of that as a GameCube game, considering it didn't come out on the GameCube until it was already released on the Nintendo Wii, which is absolutely ridiculous in itself. But anyway, Wind Waker, as I mentioned in my previous video, so I'm not going to go into it in that much detail, I wasn't a big fan of the game. I was a much bigger fan of Ocarina of Time on the Nintendo 64 and Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo. So I won't go into the details as to why I was not a big fan of the game, because if you want, you could either watch that in my previous video, or you might have already watched that already. Another game of note, I suppose, Mario Kart Double Dash. Again, not a huge fan of that one. I didn't feel it was much of a step up from Mario Kart 64. Like, I didn't really feel the game did that many new things, and it could have just been me through being a more experienced gamer, but I felt the difficulty curve had gone massively downhill when it came to Double Dash, and I managed to finish the game and do everything in it at a much faster pace than that of which I did in Mario Kart 64. So for that reason, I suppose Mario Kart Double Dash, it just felt a lot more kiddish than the previous games, which sounds like an odd thing to say about a Nintendo property in the first place, but it just felt so easy. Another game what everybody seems to love now for some reason, well, not everybody, but a much larger proportion of people than when the game actually came out, is Mario Sunshine. Now, why do so many people like that game? It is by far, and I mean by far, the weakest ever 3D Mario game. Like, why the bloody hell did they have to add that bloody flood thing to the game? It just completely ruins the mechanics of a Mario game. Like, I'm sorry, but bloody Mario is athletic enough as it is. He doesn't need a bloody jetpack as well. What was the point? Like I said, it just made the game less enjoyable. And it was a cleaning game, wasn't it? I know that really annoys people when people call it a cleaning game. But again, that was an unnecessary element we did not need in a Mario game. Like, why did they have to go so far from the formula that works? Everyone in a Mario game, I just want to be able to run and jump about and stuff. I don't want to be cleaning as well. That was stupid. So yes, Mario Sunshine is just not as fun as Mario 64, it's not as fun as the Mario Galaxy games, it's not as fun as Mario 3D Land, and it's not as fun as Mario 3D World. Again, by far the weakest ever 3D Mario game, and one of the reasons why the Gamecube's a little bit overrated to me. Because if people are trying to claim games like that on a reason why the Gamecube is the best console of all time, then you, sir, are ridiculous. Something else cool about the Gamecube, which was very novel at the time but maybe not so much anymore, was obviously this was the first Nintendo console to feature Sega games. Like, you know how mind-blowing and ridiculous that was at the time? Yeah, sure, most of the games may have just been ports of old Dreamcast games, but they were very good ports indeed. Like, many of them did actually feature upgrades which made them better than their Dreamcast counterparts. Like Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, for example, was better than the Dreamcast version. Skies of Arcadia was better than the Dreamcast version because there was less annoying random encounters and stuff like that. I believe Crazy Taxi received a better version on the Gamecube as well. And apart from that, there was new Sega intellectual properties which were decent on the system as well, like Monkey Ball. Monkey Ball was a new, fun, unique game at the time as well. Sonic Mega Collection was pretty cool at the time too, because obviously I went for a Super Nintendo when I was younger, so completely bypassed the Mega Drive altogether. So finally I could play Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Sonic the Hedgehog 3, Sonic and Knuckles, all of them on my Nintendo Gamecube. Like, do you know how cool that was at the time, playing those old 16-bit games on this? That was amazing! So yes, as I said, overall the Gamecube probably does feature a much better library of games than that of the Nintendo 64. There was definitely more third-party support. Like, if I recall, there was a lot of Capcom games on the system as well as the Sega ones. Obviously they lost Rare, but that was so Star Fox Adventure was the last Rare game on the system, but that wasn't very good, and I don't recall Rare making many good games after that either over on the Microsoft Xbox. But yes, going back to a couple of complaints, obviously another reason why people went for the PlayStation 2 over this thing was this version couldn't play DVDs, whereas everyone wanted to watch DVDs at the time, so they could just buy a PlayStation 2, and that gave them another reason to own the platform, having been DVD players being expensive at the time. So yes, no DVDs for the Gamecube unless you bought that weird Panasonic Japanese exclusive device, because I know someone will bring that up in the comment section if I don't mention it. But yes, no DVDs, but we did have the Game Boy Player which we could buy for this thing, which was a bloody cool device, and the PlayStation 2 and Microsoft Xbox never had anything like that at all. So if you bought that, it's essentially the ultimate way to play Game Boy games, Game Boy Color games and Game Boy Advance games all on your television screen. Like, how amazing is that? So that is the main reason to have a Gamecube these days, in my opinion, is to use the Game Boy Player peripheral. Because for Gamecube games themselves, obviously you can play them on the Nintendo Wii these days, so you don't want to bust out this just for that. But to play Game Boy games on the television, the Gamecube is your ultimate source of entertainment. One more thing I suppose I should bring up is the controller. This is an unofficial one I have here by Venom, because I obviously kept all my good controllers back home in England. This is many people's favourite controllers of all time, and when I hold it I can't say I disagree. It does feel like a very nice controller, but some of the problems people cite about it, and many people don't like this horrible knobbly C-stick, and when you feel it, it is a bit crap. Like, what was wrong with 2 analog sticks, for example? Why did you need this monstrosity instead? And another thing as well, why have you got 2 triggers on this side and 1 on that side? That's odd and wonky as well. Like, why could they not have put 2 on each side? Explain that to me, someone. So yes, that's what I had to say about the Nintendo Gamecube. I perhaps feel that many people in their early 20s probably do overrate the console a little bit. Maybe their brains are a little bit clouded by nostalgia, being so young. But the console came third in the console wars for a reason. So perhaps they do think a little bit too highly of it. However, on the other hand, I feel that people in their 30s and 30 plus may perhaps not give the console enough credit that it deserves, because maybe they was too wrapped up with playing the PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox at the time to even give the Gamecube a chance. But if you bust the Gamecube out, there is a great library of games there for you to enjoy. So if you're an older gentleman like myself, then I strongly advise you to give the Gamecube a chance. Is the Gamecube underrated? Is it overrated? It depends how old you are, I suppose, with this one. Cheerio!